It's Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. And we start today with an evergreen song from Gilbert and Sullivan's Aplenty.
If you go in, you're sure to win. Yours will be the charming maid, be your law. The ancient saw, faint heart never won, fair lady. Never, 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 faint heart never won, fair lady. Every journey has an end, when at the worst affairs will mend. Lock the door when day is nigh, hustle your horse and don't say die. Nothing win, blood is thick but water's thin. In for a penny, in for a pound, it's love that makes the world go round. Nothing venture, nothing win, blood is thick but water's thin. In for a penny, in for a pound, it's love that makes the world go round.
And welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and it's my view that when it comes to deciding which Gilbert and Sullivan musical that you might want to put on, you can't go wrong by taking a punt on the gondoliers. Clever wordplay. Perhaps not funny, but clever wordplay nonetheless. I hope you enjoyed the double meaning of the word punt. As I said last week, there's nothing like a joke you have to explain. Well, moving on. That's 2 Gilbert and Sullivan references we've had so far, and we're only about 2 minutes in to this episode of Musical Talk. So, the sensitive amongst you will have probably worked out that we're going to be talking about Gilbert and Sullivan and their wonderful world of music and song in today's episode. And so we are, but we're going to be looking at them in what might be called a topsy-turvy kind of a way. And if you know your Gilbertian lore, you'll know that topsy-turvydom was the term used in his lifetime to describe the way that Gilbert often structured his plots. But he's not the only one, because today we're going to be talking to the lovely Susan Ellerby, who's no mean author herself when it comes to reworking, revising and reimagining Gilbert and Sullivan operas, but more importantly, Gilbert and Sullivan's songs. And she uses a healthy dose of topsy-turvydom as well to do this. Now, if the name Sue or Susan Ellerby is ringing a bell with you, I hope it should, because Susan has now written 3 new Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. And you may say, well, how's she done that? Well, let me explain. Under the branding of Gilbert and Sullivan's Improbable new musical, Susan concocts new stories with distinctly Gilbertian flavours, and then inserts wholesale the songs of Gilbert and Sullivan from their operetta into them to make the point. Her first was called Gilbert and Sullivan's Improbable new musical, The Fringe Lozenge, and she followed that up with perhaps her masterpiece, Gilbert and Sullivan's Improbable new musical, Less Miserable. The conceit of which was that Gilbert and Sullivan are friends in heaven, and looking down on the world of musical theatre as it is today in the 21st century, with Gilbert suggesting that their songs could fit any of the situations in any piece of modern musical theatre, and Sullivan needing to be convinced. Hence Gilbert puts their songs into Les Miserables, but with a Gilbertian topsy-turvy twist. It was a masterpiece, and I'm pleased to say that Susan has followed that up with another excellent show, called Gilbert and Sullivan's Improbable new musical, and Helen. Now, this musical takes as its central conceit the idea that Gilbert and Sullivan in heaven have realised that Helen D'Oyly Carte was a truly important part of the team that made Gilbert and Sullivan successes in their lifetime and ever since, which is already on its way to becoming a 200-year legacy. And the 4 people who were the most important in creating the Gilbert and Sullivan phenomenon were, of course, W.S. Gilbert, Arthur Sullivan, Richard D'Oyly Carte, their producer and impresario, and his very able incredible wife, Helen D'Oyly Carte, who until now really hasn't had quite the credit that she deserves. This new musical, And Helen, tries to change that and succeeds admirably. Now, you could have seen And Helen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2024, because it followed its two predecessors there, because all three shows have now been presented in Edinburgh and all three have been big successes. But like so many musicals we've discussed in recent years here on Musical Talk, it was originally planned, but it ought to have gone to Edinburgh during the COVID years, and of course that simply couldn't happen. But Susan is an industrious and impressive woman, and she arranged for a virtual recording to be made of that show. And today we're going to have the great pleasure of hearing some of the recordings of the songs from the Gilbert and Sullivan catalogue, which you could hear and see in the show And Helen when it was in Edinburgh last year, but taken from the virtual recording that was produced a couple of years before that. And that explains the sound quality of the recording. It was stitched together from a number of different sources to make one musical show in audio during the COVID years, and I think it really reflects well on everyone during that period who were determined that the international pandemic should not stop creative outputs, and Susan Ellerby was one of those. So that recording that you heard at the beginning of the show comes from that audio version of And Helen. But of course it was in itself a song from Iolanthe, slightly abridged for the purposes of the new show in which it finds itself, And Helen. And I'm delighted to say that Susan has very kindly said we can use other songs from that recording, which does mean that you'll have a chance to hear some of the songs which have been interpolated into Gilbert and Sullivan's improbable new musical, And Helen. And I think it really does help to illustrate the point that Susan wants to make, which is that the songs from the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta cover almost all human experiences and can fit into almost all dramatic situations. Well, there we are. I think we've set out the table, identifying what the conceit of this show is and the concept behind it. But now let's hear another song from the recording, and then after that you'll hear my wonderful conversation with Susan as we discuss And Helen. And then there'll be another song afterwards, both of which do get mentioned in the course of the conversation. The one you'll hear at the end of the interview comes from my favourite, from Ruddigore. But the song you're about to hear now, which leads us into that conversation, is from Patience. As you're listening to this, see if you can spot the hidden Gilbert and Sullivan character in the lyrics. All will be revealed later in the episode. But first, let's hear that song, and then we'll hear from Susan Ellerby about Gilbert and Sullivan's improbable new musical, And Helen.
So go to him and say to him with compliment ironical,
Sing hey to you, good day to you, and that's what I shall say.
your style is much too sanctified, your cut is too canonical.
Sing ba to you, ha ha to you, and that's what I shall say.
I was the beau ideal of the morbid young aesthetical. To doubt my inspiration was regarded as heretical, until you cut me out with your placidity and vertical.
Sing boo to you, boo boo to you, and that's what I shall say. Sing boo to you, boo boo to you, and that's what I shall say.
Sing hey to you, good day to you, sing ba to you, ha ha to you, sing boo to you, boo boo to you, and that's what you should say. Sing hey to you, good day to you, sing ba to you, ha ha to you, sing boo to you, and that's what you should say.
Boo, boo, and that's what I shall say. Boo,
Boo, boo,
and that's what I shall say.
Well, my name's Sue Ellerby, and I'm the writer and director for the Coyley Theatre Company. We are showing a new musical called Gilbert and Sullivan's improbable new musical, And Helen.
Now, we should start by saying this is the third of a trilogy.
Yes.
Because your rather splendid brand of Gilbert and Sullivan's improbable new musical, insert name here, has produced 3 flowers so far, 3 little maids, I would argue. We've had the Fringe Lozenge, which was terribly successful a good few years ago now.
Yes, yeah.
And then we had your masterful, absolutely top-notch, Less Miserable, which was a very clever conceit. And this is the third. This is called And Helen.
It is.
But in some senses, if I may, I think it takes some of the tropes of, particularly established in the second one, which is that Gilbert and Sullivan in the afterlife are sort of chums and talk about how they have covered in their series of operetta pretty much all conditions, experiences, emotions and situations, and that can then be inserted into other stories, which you then do perfectly with less miserable, but also giving it a beautiful topsy-turvy ending. And, if I may say, a fabulously groan-worthy pun-based ending, which to this day brings both tears to my eyes and to my heart. One of joy, one of disaster. No, there's a beautiful pun and beautifully seeded at the beginning. That is a masterpiece. So that's quite a tall order to replace, isn't it? So that came up, I think, in 2019 to the Fringe. And Helen has been in gestation since then. So it's 5 years in the making for reasons I expect most people will understand. But Susan, tell me, when Less Miserable had finished, how did Anne Helen come to be, I suppose, is the question I'm lurching towards.
Okay, well, it was a wonderful experience doing Less Miserable, and normally when I'm at the Fringe, I start to get some ideas for other things. There have been a few ideas floating around my head, but it was the Anne Helen one that I think I sort of focused on. And I have to say, I don't rush writing them. I jot down a skeleton and then probably over the course of a year sort of tinker about with it and try and perfect what it is I want to do. Flesh it out a bit,
Yes.
And my intention...
Particularly as I know that you're very cleverly able to, you add your own brand of topsy-turvy homage, and that doesn't come naturally, does it, in a sense? So you have to think about how that's going to work.
Yes. And I think my plan had been that we would try and get to the Fringe at alternate years.
Yeah.
But as you say, so the show was written, but instead of coming to the Fringe, we realised we couldn't with COVID, and so we developed it as an audio version, which we took to Brighton Fringe. We pre-recorded it, everyone recorded the lines on their phones, and we had Zoom rehearsals, and actually our brilliant musical director, Vicky Hing, layered all these choral parts together, and it came up with something that I think we were all very proud of. And then, of course, now the opportunity's come to bring it back to the Edinburgh Fringe as a stage version, of which it was always intended to be. And I was just delighted today was the opening, and to actually see it on the stage as I'd envisaged. Yes, it was just wonderful. Yes.
Well, it was just wonderful, and we'll be talking about that in just a minute. But it's really interesting to me that it's had this odd side life, as it were. Envisaged as a stage musical, as your others have been, by force turned into an audio play musical, and then back to being on stage again.
Yes.
I suppose there's a question about adaptation. How easy was it to adapt your well-developed ideas for a stage play into an audio? And then, did you draw anything from the audio when you were feeding it back into the final stage play that we've got here?
Well, the first half of that, in terms of developing it for the audio, myself and Vicky sat down and thought, we didn't sat down in real life, we virtually...
You were virtually sat, yes.
Can we do this? And having seen the show today, the opening number has got that Yeoman of the Guard, where there are two different melodies, one over the other, and I think the chorus is singing in 6 parts, and then you've got a trio over it, and we thought, if we can crack that and make that work, then we can do the whole of the audio show. And we tried it, and we could, and so that's what we did. But as you know, in the stage version, occasionally sort of people are in different rooms, or you need a visual clue as to what's going on.
You do.
So we inserted some extra bits of text just to make that really clear.
Establishing bits,
Like there's a scene with Helen and Ida in the library. So we had someone ringing a bell and say the library's about to close, and we went into the scene.
Non-obtrusive, but just enough
some clues.
World building, I suppose, which is what radio is all about, isn't it, in a way?
Yeah. And then taking that then back to the stage. Actually, I don't think there was... we took those extra lines out, but I think I was reassured about the pace of the show. There are certain parts in the show where we have a sort of a company meeting to orientate you where you are with the Gilbert and Sullivan story. And I thought, would that sort of slow the pace of the show down? But when we did it as an audio, no, it seemed to bob along quite nicely, even without the dances and everything that you would normally see. But I love inserting the sort of the traditional amateur G&S choreography that you generally see if you go to see a G&S show. I've got a list of about 12 steps everybody always does, and sort of doing a bit of a parody on those. It was nice to bring to the stage.
It's really interesting that you talk about the meetings. I think we should talk briefly about then what the show is, and then we can talk about the details.
Yes.
So it's Anne Helen. Anyone who knows about Gilbert and Sullivan will probably work out that's Helen D'Oyly Carte, formerly Helen Lenoir, and Helen Black, which I learned from you today. Yeah. A very able, very impressive woman, particularly for her era, who is certainly a partner married Richard D'Oyly Carte, but was a person in her own right and a great part of the D'Oyly Carte company in her own right.
Yes.
The marriage wasn't how she got there, it's the marriage as a result of.
Yeah.
But a partner not just to Richard D'Oyly Carte, but in his business and professional capacity. And I think it is, for those people who've ever spent any time knowing, reading more widely, they'll know that she's important. Yes. But she hasn't really had her praises sung. And this show is actually a really marvellous step towards that. But I've just stolen a bit of your thunder, I'm so sorry. But if you could sort of explain what your intention was in this show about Helen D'Oyly Carte.
Well, take a step back, I suppose, about the intention of the Gilbert and Sullivan Improbable new musicals. The intention for me there is to create new stories with G&S songs and really to introduce more people to the G&S
canon.
I don't know, the wealth of those beautiful tunes and songs. And I think doing that in a show which doesn't have, if you like, the baggage maybe of some of the opera. Some people think, oh, that's old-fashioned, or they've got issues with the Mikado, or things like that, that you take it away from that and they're hearing the songs in an order they wouldn't expect, in a completely different style. And even if they don't know G&S, it's a new musical.
Yeah.
So it was trying to think of an idea for a new musical, and I have enjoyed G&S most of my life, and I have to say I wasn't as familiar with Helen. You said most people would know she was, Richard's wife.
Can I briefly say I think it's the Mike Leigh Topsy-Turvy film that's actually brought her into much more
Prominence.
people. But we're only talking 15 years ago on that.
Yes,
so it's a recent phenomenon, probably very much a 21st century one.
Yes. So yes, the more I then started to read about her and find out a bit more, I thought, well, yeah, there isn't a lot written about Helen's life. And actually, as well as running the whole D'Oyly Carte empire, it was also her sort of, I suppose, her diplomatic, her emotional intelligence. And I think without her, we wouldn't have had Joan of the God, or, appeasing the arguments and getting them to work together. So I just had this idea to do something about her life. But what I've tried to do with each of the shows is, as you say, Gilbert and Sullivan in heaven, and they're coming up with a new idea for a show. It still has to be Gilbertian, with all the usual things, the mixed up babies, or the disguises, or and the ridiculous ending at the end when everything gets tied together. So I thought, how can I insert that without, if you like, detracting from the serious story of Helen? And so the intro to the show, I suppose, says, well, we'll make a new musical, but Gilbert wants to put all these plot twists in. And they go, oh, all right then. Well, how will people know what's truth and what isn't? Oh, well, they can look it up on the internet when they get home. Yeah. So I've sort of gave myself a bit of a get out. And at the end, she does say, well, this never happened and that never happened. So hopefully I've raised awareness of her story, but really the main purpose is to entertain people and introduce people to G&S in a slightly different way. And my big hope is, for the 3 shows, that maybe other companies might think, well, we could do this, and we spread the word further.
They're very portable. And also, because they come in one-act forms, they're a perfect match for trial by jury, because every company never knows what to do when they want to put on trial by jury. Do you put it on with one of the shorter operetta, like HMS Pinafore or Pirates, or do you go for the Zoo or something like that? You find a semi-Savoy opera and then you sort of plop it in. Yeah. A Gilbert without Sullivan or a Sullivan without Gilbert. So I think this works admirably. But I do really like that idea of just shining a light on someone who's been a little bit lost and shouldn't have been lost, because it's very clear, I think, that she's a mover and shaker. And the part of her life which most proves that to me is not, funny enough, the part where she's working with Gilbert and Sullivan and Richard D'Oyly Carte. It's that period when Sullivan and D'Oyly Carte, who died within a year of each other, 1900 and 1901. It's the sort of 10, 15 years afterwards, and certainly I've read books about the Savoy operas when actually it didn't necessarily look like anything was going to survive. Yes. They were going to be consigned to Victorian history, and the exciting new world of the Gaiety musicals were sort of going to take over, and then eventually the American stuff. So it was she who sort of, as far as I understand it, sort of kept the company together, kept the wolf from the door, kept body and soul together, and then sort of set up these revivals, not just in London, but also set up national touring to bring it to the provinces and sort of keep it alive. So it's really, I think it's those first 10 years of the 20th century where the Gilbert and Sullivan legacy, the Gilbert and Sullivan survival was assured, and the one name attached to that is Helen D'Oyly Carte. Yes. Gilbert's the director, and you rather splendidly do mention that, and that's widely documented. But it was her initiative to do it. Yes. She's the business person, and he isn't. I think that's fabulous.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that you bring, that's also touched in this piece. It goes beyond the death of Sullivan, it goes beyond the death of Richard, because it's not about Richard per se, it's about Helen.
Yes, yeah.
Sorry, I keep rambling on, but I so enjoyed the show that I'm delighted by its central conceit, that's the point. But let's talk about the plot. Now, you've said, you quite rightly, you're telling the story of her through this slightly Gilbertian eyeglass, shall we say. Plus, he overtly says he's going to put in the exciting elements of his childhood, which is, of course, the famous story that he was kidnapped.
Yes, so weave that in. Yes.
And, of course, we know that's a thing that comes up time and time again.
Yes.
How did you alight on that as a story? Because it seems so obvious when you think about it that Gilbert's abduction as a very small child must have been a family story for the rest of his life.
Yes.
And of course he was going to weave that in as something that could happen in real life, because, strange as it seems, it did.
Yes. I think he wasn't kidnapped as a baby, was he? He was a bit older.
Oh, wasn't he?
But for the point of view of this story, we mix the babies up, because that's what happens in G&S, doesn't it?
All the time.
Yes. I think it was that in doing these sort of Gilbert and Sullivan parodies, that's one of the things people focus on. There has to be a mix-up, doesn't there, at the start? And that seemed to be an obvious thing. And I did know about the kidnap story just from things I've read in the past, and I thought, that's good, we could sort of weave that in. Because otherwise, you couldn't have Helen kidnapped. It would have been, too far-fetched. Yeah. And it just seemed like a gem of an idea that I thought we can weave that. And of course, it leads to a comedy piece, doesn't it, with the cat. And I wanted to bring the cat in. I thought that was quite funny.
Which anyone who knows their G&S will know immediately you're referring to the song from HMS Pinafore, where the sailors are skulking around the deck or trying not to be seen, and Dick Deadeye's giving the game away.
Yes, exactly.
It's the other way around. They're skulking on desk, and it's Captain Corcoran and Dick Deadeye whipping and making noises. We should talk about the score. We'll come back to the plot in a minute, but there's a lot of music here, nicely retooled. I mean, your central conceit, and this is what we keep coming back to, that Gilbert and Sullivan covered everything in some form, does allow you, therefore, to illustrate your piece with a broad range of music. Was it difficult to find something appropriate every time, or did it just you just thought about it for a minute and think, actually, no, that something from the Mikado, or here's something from Ruddigore, or whatever it is?
No, it didn't seem difficult. As you got the story, you just think, there's a bit where D'Oyly Carte and Helen are getting to know each other, and is he going to propose or whatever, and hail the bridegroom, hail the bride, just seems like that's obvious, and we can weave it in this way. So and
it's about the time Ruddigore's on as well, isn't it?
Yes,
it was beautiful
so
symmetry there.
They were rehearsing Ruddigore at the time. I've never struggled to find a G&S piece to fit any of the scenes, and sometimes I've got too many and I have to sort of pare back, because you don't want it to be overloaded with people just thinking, there's a joke going on here, I don't get it. If they weren't G&S, they have to fit as if it was a musical and this was a natural song, I suppose. Yeah. And what I've done in all three, I've not used any of the same songs in any of the three of them, which just shows how much music there is out there.
And you're still rejecting songs for duplication, as it were.
Yes. I did have a slight concern with this one, in that I think that there are a lot more snippets of songs, whereas I think in the last show there were more sort of full verses, if you like, whereas there's occasionally the odd just couple of lines, like farewell and stuff, but it seems to work, I think.
Well, I think there were several today, and you can tell me I'm wrong here, but it felt to me that actually there were one or two, I think, where you hadn't used the full song exactly as you say, and we might have had just a verse or a chorus, and I can't remember which it was, but there was one I was thinking, I know this, of course, and this is sometimes a bit of a throwaway, and actually to bring it, by which I mean, there are, in all musicals, there are there's the headline stuff that's that will be on the album, if you look, in a modern sense, and then there are the ones which are the filler. You see it in Gershwin musicals and Cole Porter musicals. Everyone knows Anything Goes is full of absolutely top-notch hits, but then there's the song Bon Voyage, you mean Bon Voyage, which very few people will be able to bring to mind, and just wasn't covered by Frank Sinatra. It's a lovely piece, it sort of fits the show, it's an amuse-bouche before you get on to the next big one. And I thought you'd managed to construct something similar from Gilbert and Sullivan, which is not an area I would have necessarily thought that, but actually these songs are so rich, and actually the verse and the chorus, if you can separate things and make them live again just because you're putting them in a different light.
Yes.
Were you surprised by anything fitting so perfectly?
Oh, there was a little flower beneath the old oak tree.
From
was a
Radical?
song. Yeah, I wasn't that familiar with, but I heard it in Radical, and I thought, oh, that just fits beautifully when Richard D'Oyly Carte has died, and she's got this huge empire to take on, and she's looking at the picture and thinking, oh, you know, he's
My
gone
protector's
now.
gone, yeah.
How am I going to do this? I thought that was a particular moment that I really liked.
And it fits emotionally, you know, and if there's a complaint levelled against Gilbert in particular, is that sometimes it's not always what we would recognise in 21st century terms as gushingly emotional.
Yes.
You know, it is possible to argue that we've gone too far on the pendulum. If any composers are listening, please pay attention, take notes. But, you know, where people burst into heartfelt emotion at the drop of a hat. And actually, certainly that's not the British cultural position, I would argue. But it is lovely that that song works so very nicely. It's a tender moment, but also it really shows her predicament. I mean, it's almost as though it could have been written for this show this year rather than 130 years ago.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think about a lot of the songs, that they just fit perfectly. Back in the less miserable one, the Sorry Her Lot features, which it just featured absolutely beautifully on that sort of on my own equivalent of Les Mis, and you think, yes, it doesn't matter they were written so long ago, that they're very relevant now. I think that the original operettas, I think some of the language in that doesn't fit so perfectly as now, but the songs, I think many of them just are easily transportable.
Now, another thing I'd like to talk about, if I may, and I don't know how much you realise this, I'm sure you do, but if you don't, I'm telling you, very funny. And that funniness, that comedy is often injected by you. There are so many wonderful throwaway gags. So the plot itself is funny, you know, there are real laughs in it, as well as the serious underside, of course. And then there's the topsy-turvy structural stuff. But actually, I mean, in the dialogue. So you've given Helen a sort of a speech characteristic whereby she likes to say, as the old phrase goes, and then she quotes the phrase, and of course, if you know your G&S, she's quoting from Gilbert's lyrics, as though they were, well, they often are based on day-to-day or relatively well-known phraseology. But this is her thing, you know, she likes to speak in colloquial English, but the colloquial English she always speaks is Gilbert's. And then there are other throwaway descriptions. The one I mentioned to you before we started recording is I love the fact that the young Helen refers to her strict head teacher at school as she's leaving school as born sneering, which of course is a line from the Mikado. These together make a very rich broth. That's obviously your intention to do that. How easy is it to do that, to make that sound sort of natural and funny, but without, and I think you touched on this, without getting too in-jokey.
Yes.
It's there if you get it.
Yeah, I don't quite know why I seem to remember a lot of G&S lyrics, but somehow, maybe it was my childhood going to watch G&S, but they seem to be in there, so that when I'm writing it, I automatically think, oh, could do this quote, could do that quote. And I have to say, it's more trying to pull them back rather than, they just seem, there are so many apt phrases, I think, that you can insert, that it's the plot comes first and then the phrases fit it, rather than thinking, oh, I've got to try and fit in, you know, this, oh, mercy, or whatever it might be, you know, a segment. It just sort of seems to fit. I don't quite know how or why it works, but yes, and there is that issue about trying not to make any of the audience feel excluded if they don't get the joke, that in a way the dialogue should still flow. But I suppose when you talk about airy persiflage and things, maybe it doesn't quite, you know, it's a bit of an odd thing to say. So yes, just try not to overplay those sort of parts.
But on the other hand, that one's such a particular phrase, isn't it? But even if you're not familiar with the quotation, once again from the Mikado, you can probably work out, if you don't know anything about G&S, for that sounds like a particularly Gilbertian phrase, and you get the joke because you understand the structure of it, even if you don't get the content. Whereas all the others are sort of they're just throwaways, but so deliciously plopped in. You know, it's the kind of thing that any school girl, any school child would say about their teacher. But you know, it's the old sneery Perkins or whatever the school nickname would be. You know. No, I like that very much, and I do think the show's very funny.
Thank you.
Do you know, I keep tossing in the words topsy-turvy. Mm-hmm. Do you... the topsy-turvy plot in this piece is mostly related to the... I don't want to spoil anything, but it's related, if it's related to anything, to the Gilbertian baby swap plots, which we've seen elsewhere.
I don't think you'd spoil anything. It is heavily signalled, isn't it, what's going on?
Well, that's fair, but but I don't want to explain what the outcome is.
Okay,
so I think that's very nice. But did you have any trouble marrying that to the Helen story? I mean, it doesn't look like it, but, you know, in the engineering part of the process, you know, when we were sitting here with the blueprints thinking, actually, will this building fall over?
Yeah. One thing I did do was look at the dates of all the operettas and looked at what was happening in the G&S storyline at the time. You know, so when was it they fell out? When was it when they decided to build the Royal Opera House? Or, you know, and then thought, so the structure does have, at some key points, there's a company meeting where they're discussing some big issue of Helen going to America or, you know, as I say, building the Opera House, whatever it might be. And then so then, in a way, trying to work the plot around those events to some degree is how it sort of evolved.
Well, it is her biography in a way, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, you know, she's so inextricably tied up in the Gilbert and Sullivan story and the D'Oyly Carte story.
Yeah.
Completely, that you'd be hard pressed to do it any different way, I think.
Yeah, I mean, things like her going to America, you think, well, obviously they'd be on the dockside, wouldn't they? We'll have the sailors in, you know, and then
of course,
and it was around the time of the aesthetic movement as well, wasn't it? So maybe we could weave that in, and then obviously the songs follow.
I also like the fact that, you know, you're not shy of pointing out the mechanics of it all, that Gilbert asks Helen when she's over in America looking after the American premiere of the Pirates Penzance to see how big this craze of sweeping Britain is doing in America, because obviously he's got a mind on America. I do like the fact that it's very clear they're business people. You know, there's a contract right at the beginning of the story.
Yes.
And it's her ability to act as, I think, essentially company secretary, certainly in the, you know, and it's underlined by the board meetings, which I want to talk about in just a minute, really shows off her skills once again. I mean, it's actually, when you sit down and just think about it, if someone said to you, I'm sending, if you were a Victorian, and someone said to you, I'm sending my woman over to America to put on a full Gilbert and Sullivan as a premiere in a version which hasn't yet quite been completed in the United Kingdom, while I run it here, that just screams, well, first of all, an amazing woman. Yeah. It screams a huge amount of trust, which doesn't feel like our understanding of the era. And it also says business. But, you know, it's you can see how amazing she is, actually. You've thrown a lot of light on it. Almost casually in a way, which I think is better, because actually if you can over egg the pudding, you know, and sing anthems, but actually deeds are, you know, it's always show rather than tell, isn't it? So I think it's a better way of illustrating that, and you've done that so nicely.
I think there's the business side of it, obviously, and the fact she went to university, but she couldn't get a degree, and she spoke several languages. Which
is the plot of Princess Ida, essentially.
and the fact that it happened in that era, as you say. But I think what seems really striking about Helen is that she had this tremendous business ability, and I mean, she did become an expert in copyright, didn't she? And she put in a lot of features that continue today. But also, it seems like she had this absolutely brilliant diplomatic side to her. She looked after the company, she appeased their arguments, and she had vision. You know, how much of all the things where we talk about, you know, the electric lights and see, I mean, all of that, she must have had a hand in a lot of that.
She must. I mean, she seems to be quite a modern woman for the era, quite a modern woman now, to be brutal, but you know, I'm not sure things have moved on nearly enough. But it'd be lovely to know what it would have been like if it was all happening now, wouldn't it?
Yes.
We could do the new Opera House in London, I think. So, were there any things that you, when you were developing it, that actually you wanted to put in, but actually in the end you simply couldn't? What avenues did you not take?
I'd like, I hadn't written it, but would have liked there to be a disguise in and a mistaken identity, and I couldn't fit that in. But no, nothing off the top of my head I can think where. No, that was the only bit of the plot where I think if you said let's lay out all the segments of what you find in G&S, it would have been quite good to have somebody, mistaken for somebody else later on.
Industrial espionage, a spy from a rival company. Now, we've mentioned the board meetings all the way through, and they're a very good way of sort of punctuating the story, actually. I think I know you were worried about the pacing as a result of that, but actually I think what it does, it makes it beautifully episodic. Okay. It helps time travel, which is always a difficult issue. You know, we're talking a span of her leaving school, so we're talking 40, 50 years. But the board meetings are very good. So first of all, you see the business side of things. You can see how she immediately, you know, makes herself invaluable. And there's a lovely little throwaway in one of the earlier ones where Richard D'Oyly Carte says, "Oh, it looks like Helen's provided us with an agenda."
Yes,
and you
yes.
think, what kind of meeting were you thinking of having without an agenda? So, that, but also, she's putting into practice what she knows. She's also taking up the dictum that he had given her, which is actually the best way to advance is to do it.
Yes.
And,
yeah.
she seems very hands-on.
Yeah.
But the joy of these things is it helps time pass. It also lets you know where we are in terms of which musical is being written and which episode in the Gilbert and Sullivan story as well as the D'Oyly Carte story. It's interesting, isn't it? Because what it really does, it allows us to see the dynamics of the relationships over time as the relationships start to fail.
Yes.
Not between Helen and Richard, but between
Yes.
Arthur and William, if I may be so bold.
Yeah.
I never really had them on first name terms before, or Willie if I was intimate. I also like the fact that Gilbert insists that Helen calls him Willie very early on and some time before
Yes.
Sullivan and even
Yes.
D'Oyly Carte, yes.
Yeah. No, I did like to try and develop that relationship between Gilbert and Helen, because I think that was, from my understanding, I think Sullivan and Carte were very, they moved in more similar circles,
Yes.
didn't they? And I think Sullivan was best man, wasn't he, the wedding? And I think Gilbert was a little bit on the periphery of that trio, if you like, whereas I think he had an ally in Helen.
Yes, and by all accounts, and I don't necessarily mean salaciously, but I think it sounds like Gilbert was, when it comes to friends, he was less likely to argue with his female friends than he was with his male friends. He seems to be quite cantankerous with his male friends, or at least a little bit of a martinet, and therefore offended. So I think that ties in very correctly with him.
Yeah.
You mentioned the choreography. And I think you rather gently suggested it's a spoof of traditional Amdram G&S.
Yes.
So you're 12...
Did you recognise all the
Well,
Amdram
I've seen variants on what I saw on a number of occasions.
Yes.
But this is obviously something from your experience, Susan.
Oh, well, I like watching GNS. So if I'll go to an Amdram GNS if there's one on, and I think GNS, if it's done with enthusiasm, it's always enjoyable, isn't it? And but there are the same moves that you see, going underneath the arches, the knee bobs, they're doing a daisy chain, and parading round, and symmetry on the stage, and so yes, I just weave all of those in, I think.
And some of those, of course, have sort of come from Gilbert's direction himself from many years ago and sort of been watered down over 130 years of production.
Yes.
As you say, the symmetry on the stage.
Yeah.
I immediately think of, as I always do, Rudigore. But in this case, I once was a very abandoned person.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that dance.
Where they do literally,
Yes.
husband and wife now dance in,
Yes.
in parallel, I think is the nicest way of putting it, and certainly symmetry. Which also oddly underlines their compatibility as characters. I think there is a purpose to that. But I like the fact you've spotted this. And then, so how exactly do you enhance the choreography to make it plain that it's a thing and not just dancing?
I think the aim is to do the GNS choreography that you see in many productions, but to try and do it very well. So everybody goes off on the right foot, and so it has that sense of joy about it.
Slightly more neatness, perhaps.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, we rehearse it
of course,
very thoroughly, the dances, but the moves are quite. I think they'd ring a bell with somebody who watches GNS.
Yes, a feel of a place, but
Yes.
but as you say, in some ways neater, I think, or better.
Although there were some different moments in this. We have amongst the cast a really good dancer
do
who
you?
played Richard D'Oyly Carte, and so there's one particular number where just after Trial by Joy he sings the man who can run a theatrical crew, which I thought was a very apt
With a
song.
cane.
Yeah, with
Yes.
a cane, and because it's sort of that transition from music hall to the operettas, it sort of fitted with the musical dynamic of having a sort of a tap dance type thing.
It absolutely did. I'm very, very pleased you popped in a song from the Grand Duke, and it is exactly the right one.
Yes.
Were you able this time to get a song from all of the shows? I know that was something you tried to do very much with...
Yeah, there's music from every show.
There you are.
Not necessarily a song from every show.
Yes, I didn't recognise anything from Utopia per se, but you're now going to tell me there was.
There will be, although I have to say, once I've written it, that's when my head's
Oh,
in
yes,
that
it's
place,
done, isn't
and
it?
then I sort of scoot into directing. So I'm sure in the script at the front, I have all the songs listed, and I say which
You know
operetta
where they
they're
are.
from.
Lovely.
Yes.
And I'd say you you bamboozled me. There was at least one piece of music which I did not recognise, and it wasn't until you and I sort of spoke afterwards when you identified it as being Ilanthi, which I therefore have heard 1,000 times. And I just thought, well, that's interesting. But it goes to show how interesting it is and how possible it is to retool and make things seem fresh. It's not just a story with old Gilbert and Sullivan songs popped into it. It does cohere. There is a path to be taken, and the narrative path allows you to look at those songs in a slightly different way to the way you're expecting and are used to, and that's so refreshing. I'm very, very pleased with that.
Oh, good.
For you.
Like the Boo to You, Poo Poo to You, that fitted so perfectly with Sullivan having to stand up to the Leeds festival director sort of thing. Yes, it's in a different context, isn't it, in the operetta?
It is. Mark, I've seen that one done elsewhere before. I'm sure you're aware, but well, it's very appropriate. We're talking at the Edinburgh Fringe. Probably 50 years ago now, was when Hinge and Brackett first burst on the scene at the Fringe, won a comedy award, and then went on to have the careers that they had. Both now past, of course, but particularly in the 70s, when their act was still quite stage-based, and it was singer and accompanist, they would always do
that song,
Cry Boo to You. With great comic aplomb, because they were detaching it from the piece. And then, there was, you can exaggerate the poos and the boos and the bars, which of course is a hidden poo bar in there somewhere, isn't there?
Oh, there is?
Yes.
I hadn't spotted that.
Making an early appearance. Well, come over here where the poo bar can't hear us, and we'll carry on the conversation. Which, of course, is another thing you reference as well. There's the dichotomy, which I don't want to ruin, but there's a lovely moment of dual personality for the purposes of the plot. And we actually do get these sort of come over here where
can't hear us. Yes.
What are you most pleased about it? Because, as you quite rightly pointed out, you're not just the writer, you're a director. And that's a big ask. But now you're seeing it on stage. Today is the day it's finally arrived. What do you... Can you identify which of your babies you love the most, or
what am I most pleased about?
Yes. Or any moments you particularly delight you?
I think it's just wonderful seeing it on the stage and see it come to life. And as we've gone through the rehearsal process, we've tried out lots of different things, and some things we've had to toss away and other things we've brought in. And the fact that actually it's come together and the cast are having a great time performing it, and the fact that the audience seem to enjoy it. And at the end of the day, that's probably the primary thing, is create something that people want to see and have fun. And we've got a very early slot at the Fringe,
9:45 in the morning.
So I hope people, I can't imagine somebody going away without being uplifted a bit by Sullivan's music.
It was the perfect start to my day. First show I've seen today, and just so you know, as you saw, but to record the fact, that was almost completely full. That was a very full auditorium. I was stunned because the queue... Well, no, when I arrived, the queue was already out of the door of the building to get in. And that's quite rare. Anyway, full stop. It's certainly rare for that time in the morning. And the other thing that people won't be aware of is that there's also been an enormous thunderstorm and the place was sopping. So the fact that people still came out, there's a real appetite for this. I'd love to know if these are people who've seen your previous shows and know what they're getting, or people who just love G&S, or walk up. That sounds interesting. But it was a great success from my point of view. But as I say, you asked me afterwards how I might describe it, and I'm going to use the word again: delightful. In its most blunt and accurate basis, it brought me delight. So I did come out uplifted. I had a very, very enjoyable start to my day. Unfortunately, slightly punctured by the second show I saw, which I shall not mention. But it's reviving now in your company, if I may say. So. But no, I think it's a genuinely great piece, and I really love that you're able. I said at the beginning that you've got this great idea about Gilbert and Sullivan and Heaven, and the universality of their songs and the breadth of their canon. But actually, that doesn't mean that your shows are mining the same vein every time.
They're very different shows.
They are, and you could have, after Less Miserable, because it was so brilliant, found other well-known stories and musicals and do the same thing with. And you could still do that in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, because you'd be mixing it up. But this is very different again. It's biographical, whilst also retaining all the flavours that we've been talking about. And, I'm hoping that there'll be further shows down the line. I'm not going to ask you to commit to anything, but I hope that, this still feels like a very rich set of possibilities. So I'm hoping we might have these kind of conversations on and off, let's say, pandemics pending, every alternative year.
And I would add, though, one of my real hopes is that others will pick up the scores and the scripts. So they're all published now on Amazon. And in fact, since we did Les Miserables, 2 other companies have done the show. One in New York at the Rochester Fringe.
Oh, wonderful.
And another in the UK. And some others had bought performance licenses, but again, it was pandemic time, so they didn't.
They don't always happen, but they could happen.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to see. I just think it might be a way of introducing G&S to wider audiences, and particularly, I know some G&S societies are struggling for audiences. This might just might attract a different audience member.
I couldn't agree more. It's very doable, if that makes sense, isn't it? It is. If you've got any music society, whether it be G&S based or it's Oklahoma every 2 years or whatever it is, could do this.
Yeah.
So how can people get in contact with you?
So, well, the scripts and scores are available on Amazon,
as you say,
with the full title, Gilbert and Sullivan's Improbable New Musical, and then whichever show it is. And within that, it's just got the contact details to get in touch. As I say, we have, they do have a performance licence, which is really just a peppercorn amount, but more just to be aware of where the show is being
so you're aware of what's happening,
and
yes.
knowing that they're using the same script and the same songs and things.
And is there because you're the Coily Dart company,
yes, yeah.
That's fairly easy to remember if you know anything about Gilbert and Sullivan.
Yeah.
Does it have a website?
Not a website.
Or socials?
Facebook page, Coily Dart Theatre, and at Coily Dart is our Twitter account. So yes, you can get in touch that way. Or even coilydart@gmail.com is our email address.
Perfect. Well, Sue, thank you very much for, first of all, talking to me.
Thank
It's
you,
been really
Thos.
interesting.
It's lovely to talk to a G&S enthusiast.
As I can't reciprocate enough. But also, thank you for bringing up yet another great show. As I say, this is such a rich idea that you've got in the broadest sense over the 3 shows and hopefully into the future. But Anne Helen is a very worthy addition to your canon.
Oh, thank you.
And let's hope that we can perhaps ultimately be talking longer than the original G&S runs.
Thank you.
If you finish on the a version of the Grand Duke, we'll know what's happened. Sue, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, Thos.
There grew a little flower 'neath a great oak tree. When the tempest came to lower, little heeded she. No need had she to cower, for she dreaded not its power. She was happy in the bower of her great oak tree. Sing hey, like a day. Sing hey, like a day. Let the tears fall free for the pretty little flower and the great oak tree. Sing hey,
Sing hey,
like a day,
like a day.
Sing hey,
Sing
hey, like a day, Sing hey, like a day. Let the tears fall free
for the pretty little flower and the great oak tree.
Sing hey,
Sing hey, like a day. Hey, like a day. Like a day. Like a day.
There we are. That was the wonderful Susan Ellerby talking to me about her latest musical, And Helen. And as you heard, if you're interested in finding out more about that show, or even performing it, then you can do so. The scripts and the score are available to buy on Amazon. And if you want to find out more about the Coily Dart Theatre Company, Coylydart, Coily Dart, which is a joke on D'Oyly Carte, of course, but spelt slightly differently, even with the juxtaposition of letters. And you can contact Sue, as she said, by using coilydart@gmail.com, but they also have a Coily Dart Theatre Facebook page, and a quick search online will certainly find them. I think Susan's come up with a really wonderful idea about retooling Gilbert and Sullivan's songs and showing that they still have worth and value, not just within the context of the original operettas, but beyond, which does suggest that they have greater meaning, greater depth, and in fact speak to the human condition, even here, a quarter of the way through the 21st century. Which, when you bear in mind Gilbert and Sullivan started a quarter of the way before the end of the 19th century, 150 years essentially, then that's something really quite amazing and speaks of the universality of the sentiments that they were able to put into theatre. And so perhaps it's no real surprise that Gilbert and Sullivan are still a household name in 2025. And as I said in the episode, one of Susan's musicals will make a very good double bill if you're proposing to put on Trial by Jury. So do go and have a look at the scripts online. However, for the time being, I think that brings this episode to an end. Now, usually, as you know, I go through a little bit of a rigmarole at the end of the episodes, building up to the word goodbye. But today I'm going to take a short extract from the recording of And Helen, which I think serves rather better. And then after that we'll hear one more song from that show to close the episode properly. So, a double bill if you like. Or perhaps more accurately, a double helping from just one bill, that being William Gilbert. And so, as stated, let's hear that very appropriate closing music. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2025, except for the songs where the recording and performance copyright remains with Susan Ellerby and the D'Oyly Carte Theatre Company. And my thanks go to Susan for allowing me to play these wonderful renditions of Gilbert and Sullivan songs in this episode.
So please yourself not to regret if we have failed in etiquette. Towards another work so high we shall know better by and by. But youth of course must have its fling, so pardon us, so pardon us.
And don't it, girls, happy spring, be hard on us, if we incline to dance and sing.
Tra-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la, but youth of course must have its fling, so pardon us. And don't it, girls, happy spring, be hard on us, but youth of course must have its fling, so pardon us. Tra-la-la-la-la-la, 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 tra-la-la-la-la-la.
To find out more about the world of musical talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your favourite podcasts. And follow us on all the usual social media networks.
Last time I was there, though, it was the same time as the Commonwealth Games, and that swimming pool right next to it was one of the Commonwealth, because it was being held in Scotland.
Yeah.
And it was just coming to the end as the Fringe was just revving up. And I had a friend staying with me for the first 2 days, and we met for breakfast. And we went to breakfast, and standing next to us in tracksuits, literally taking eggs from the counter and bacon, were Jacques Law and Chris Mears, who were at the time.
Yeah.
But, just think, I've seen you on the television.
Yeah. There you are, yeah. Good.
Anyway, there we are.
We've had bagpipers from noon till dusk, actually.
They used to practice, yeah.
Oh, they do, and they're doing all the march and the drums. I think they're for the tattoo, so they get bussed in, I think.
Oh, that's interesting. Certainly, one year I was there was an international bagpiping festival. Lots of Americans had come over who fancied themselves as Scottish, obviously.
Oh, right. Well, somebody did also mention a bagpipe festival, so maybe it's both. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of it about.
Yes.
Just my final D'Oyly Carte thing. This has irritated me so much recently. I still buy, artifact music, so CDs and things like that, rather than streaming everything. I'm just not that generation. And I noticed there's a compilation of, it's called The Best of Gilbert and Sullivan or something like that. And they've got some famous caricatures. There's a very famous caricature of Sullivan, but the person who's compiled and designed the box doesn't know Gilbert, and so he's put D'Oyly Carte on. Because he obviously thinks that's Gilbert and Sullivan, but it's not. And I look at this, every time I walk past it, I just get furious. I'm delighted that D'Oyly Carte's on there. I'm furious, but Gilbert isn't. And now I want Helen on there too.